Hello, everyone. Welcome to the CP Sessions Call to Love, Call to Hope. We're streaming live every weekday at noon and 7 p.m. Eastern Time here on Facebook. My name is Laura. I am on the Cleveland team, and today I am super jazzed to be speaking with Father Ryan Mann. Maybe it's the Duncan, maybe it's because he's the greatest priest alive. I don't know. I think it's the latter. But just to give you some background on who this man is, Father Ryan is a priest in the Diocese of Cleveland. He's involved in several different ministries and different things and has a heart for TOB. He often serves as a chaplain for the Theology of the Body Institute courses. And I've also had the utmost privilege of having him as a chaplain here on Team Cleveland. And so, Father Ryan, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us this afternoon.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be with you. I absolutely have enjoyed Culture Project and obviously Team Cleveland, but just everything Culture Project's doing. So I'm very, very honored and so happy to be here with you.
Awesome. All right. So today, the topic of the day, for those of you who don't know, is something fun. We're going to be talking about male celibacy. So get ready, y'all. And I think that this is just such a needed conversation because I think nowadays, when people hear the word celibacy, they often just automatically assume that something's wrong with it. And I think that's often where the conversation starts and it stays. And so, Father Ryan, we were talking previously just about this, and you were mentioning to me like there's another way to go about speaking about celibacy. So from your perspective, like how do you think this conversation should begin and then proceed?
Well, yeah, thanks, Laura. Well, so celibacy is usually always brought up in the context of like, sad to say, a priest makes the evening news for something wildly immoral and at times illegal. And so usually the question of celibacy is brought up in light of that. And so usually it's brought up with suspect and a lot of criticism and it's outdated and all these type of things. And I know it in my own family, my dad's side of the family, I grew up half Jewish. So my dad's also Jewish. So in the Jewish tradition, having children and kids, that's one of the blessings of God in what we call the Old Testament. So to forego it freely is mind-blowing to my siblings, my half-brother and siblings. So I get a lot of criticism and mockery in my own family. As time's gone on, they see that I'm happy. It's kind of lessened. But I think we don't get many times where like Culture Project's giving today, where the church and Jesus and his representatives like the priests, where we even get a chance to first begin with what is beautiful or what is powerful about celibacy, to see the positive, the great yes that's involved, both God's yes to a man that he calls to it and my yes back to God, to see that beautiful yes first. And so I was mentioning to you, this came to light for me my second year of priesthood at a wedding reception. And most priests, I think, would have known this exact situation. So when you go to a wedding reception, and I don't go to every one of them, but you go and you got the cocktail hour and everyone's coming up to you telling you a couple different things. They loved your homily. So thank you for working with the couple. They're great kids, all this stuff. Or they're saying, I don't go to church, Father, and, sorry about that, as if somehow it's now okay with God because over a drink you said you were sorry. But as it unfolded, like it does most time, you, as a priest, you know that they all have one main question that they've never been able to ask a priest, but they don't know when or how. And it's the celibacy question. So this one party, it continued. We have dinner. Everyone at the tables have more and more drinks. And desserts now served. Dancing's begun. The music went from dinner jazz to like top 40. And no one's left my table. And finally, they kind of like all looking at the spouses, and they finally look at me and they say, what's with the whole celibacy thing? And how do you do it? And they don't realize like to the extent in which they're sharing about their own lives when they say questions like that, like, how do you do it? But I answered, I said, well, it's a combination of self-knowledge and discipline and good friends and things like that. Now, it's not that that wasn't true, but I realized driving home that night, I failed at what celibacy is meant to do. Celibacy is meant to draw people in to think, you're kind of weird. What is celibacy? And then I'm meant to point to the reality of Jesus alive, that he has given me the grace to live this, to point to him in a radical way. And so the real thrust of celibacy is an evangelical thrust to kind of put in people's faces that God isn't an ideal. He's not distant. He's not in some other world. But rather, he's so real that I could actually say yes to him and forego one love to say yes to a deep and abiding, intimate love. And so it's not so much that celibacy is a no to marriage, as much as it is a yes to the ultimate marriage of God's union with humanity that happens in through Christ. So when I failed at that wedding reception, but I remember driving home being like, I'm not going to fail again at this. Next time someone asks, how do you do it? I'm going to say, Jesus. And then after there, I can give any other reason I want. But I think that's where celibacy is so, we fail as a church often explaining it because it's in such like psychological, natural terms. And no one really gets it still. They're like, well, if that's what it is, why do it? And it's only when you point to this mystery and this transcendent love that is infinite and also intimate that it really challenges people with the idea that Jesus can fulfill every desire, that people begin to see the mystery and the power of it.
That's like such a beautiful way to describe it. And I love that story of just like those couples like sitting around the table, kind of like all like wanting to ask, because I think there is this curiosity about it because it's often painted, like you said, in this different picture and people don't understand the true beauty and that it is a gift. And that it's just like not saying no to marriage. It's actually like this greater yes. So that's just a beautiful way to start this conversation as we talk about celibacy. And so kind of just wanting to follow up with that, a few other questions that I have for you, just as we build this foundation, just like in general, like very practical sense, is every priest required to remain celibate? And like, why is this a vow that priests take? Like, if you can elaborate on some of those points as well.
Yeah. So basically, the answer is yes. Every priest is asked to. Basically, the reason I say basically is in the Eastern Catholic tradition, which you are, Laura, you're Byzantine. Okay. Your priests are given an option. They have to be married before they receive holy orders, but married men can be priests. However, if you're going to be a bishop in the Eastern Church, you still have to have been celibate for the sake of the kingdom. In the Latin Rite or Roman Rite, minus some odd variances here and there, yes, you are called to be celibate for the sake of the kingdom. And so, yeah, priests are required to take this vow. And the reason why they make this is, it says in the Catechism that they would have an undivided heart for God. Now, that's kind of abstract, what that means. But I think if you put it in the practical, we can see it pretty quickly. Like, I know some really holy married couples, and I know like a holy mom who stays at home with her kids. And so she's all day long and she's preparing to go to do some adoration at her local parish. And she's excited. But her husband comes home and he's had the worst day. And now she's torn. I want to go be with the Lord in the Eucharist. And yet my vocation, where I promise to love and honor my spouse, is making a demand on me. My husband needs me to pour him a beer and sit down and to love on him and listen to him and encourage him. See, she has a beautiful heart and that she wants to be with the Lord. And she's Catholic enough to know that to be with the Lord means to honor her vocation, that God's grace comes to her through her vocation. So she has to stay with a creature. Her husband, not creature in the negative sense, not like, but like creature, right? God made him. And so she has to stay with this creature and be with him and love him. And that's the way she'll grow in holiness. There's nothing wrong with that. However, as a celibate man for the kingdom, rarely is that the question for me, right? I am freed up to follow God and the people God entrusts to me. This year it's been Culture Project, right? So I've get this great joy to love on you and the other ones at the Cleveland team. But like it's a freedom to love God and the places where God's at. So that's why they do it. Maybe another reason, maybe this is the one that probably is most powerful to me, is that it's because I'm meant to witness to the reality of marriage. All right, so there's two marriages in the Bible. There's the earthly marriage of man and woman from the book of Genesis, and it doesn't get forfeited in original sin. It continues through the Old Testament, even through Jesus' time in our own. It's a beautiful dignity. It bears the image of God. In Christ's time, it even has a sacrament So it points to the language and life of Christ where he participates. It's a way of sanctity. However, there's another image of marriage, which is the wedding feast of the Lamb, which is in the book of Revelation. And this is, Jesus is the Lamb of God, and Jesus has a bride. It's known as the church. So there's another marriage, Christ and the church. So celibacy points to marriage, but which marriage? Well, it points to the heavenly marriage of Christ and the church. And that's the marriage I'm already participating in and giving witness to. Because it's not just a one day by the mercy of God, hopefully. It actually, that marriage came down to earth in Jesus, and he dies on the cross saying, this is my body given up for you, his bride. He says, it is finished, but in Latin, consumanda est, it is consummated. And so that is the marriage I'm already participating in. I just want to say real practically, because this is the like Father Ryan Mann language. So anyone listening, they can dismiss it. It's not like church, but here it is that married couples remind me of what God is like. He's passionate and intimate. He's tender, patient, forgiving. He endures through tough times. He's not going anywhere no matter what. So that's what they witness to me and to the world, that this is what God's love is like. He wants union and more life. I witness to married couples that as good as they have it, there's still a greater reality, that is not God. Married love, sexual love can become an idol because of all the pleasure associated with it, and we can get so dizzied by it. I witness to them that there's only one God. And yes, he's like your marriage, but he's infinitely greater because he's an infinite love. And he's invited me to witness to his love to the whole world. So that's kind of the call on why we do it.
No, I so think that is a really wonderful explanation, and just like even how you see it through your own lens, like being a priest and looking to the other vocations to see what that reveals. And just like how we are all called to grow in holiness according to our vocation. So like you were saying, celibacy does point to this marriage, but you have this capacity in your state in life to just have, as you were saying, this undivided heart to God. So like that freeing you up to just love the people who places in your life in a very unique way, and to be a father to them. So I think that is just such a good image to paint when it comes to celibacy. And as we're like beginning this more of this conversation about the distinction with like married couples and the priesthood and that vocation, something that might come up is like, okay, like if sex is good, then why do priests make a vow not to have it? If you can just like maybe touch on that point and elaborate on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, sex is incredibly good. It was given before there was sin in the world, right? So before there was original sin, Genesis 3, Genesis 1, God says, be fruitful and multiply. All right. So God knows how that happens. So it's not like he said that. He's like, I don't know how there'll be babies, but just go make babies. He knows. He created us for that. And he called it very good. And so in the beginning, God was delighting in, and part of his flourishing for all of creation was man and woman madly in love and enjoying the flourishing of creation as they gave themselves to each other in love and in sexuality. Original sin wreaks havoc on that pretty quickly, but it doesn't destroy it. It just kind of twists it up. But we notice it right away because Adam and Eve are now separated from each other after the fall. And it says they have fig leaves, prick leaves are covering their private parts. And so it's incredibly difficult for them now. So that's a good sign that right away, what was a sign of God's love in the world, communicated as male and female becoming one, now became a source of shame and fear and brokenness. Right? And so that story continues, but God immediately speaks promises of redemption, and in Christ there's redemption happening. All right, so as a priest, we still think sex is incredibly good, but we don't think sex is God. And in a fallen world where original sin and the devil and our culture, which is so confusing, is still incredibly in charge. Jesus is real, he rose, his power is unleashed. But it is a battle in our hearts, in our culture, on media, and we're all broken, but thank God there's mercy. But sex is good, but it's not the greatest good. And when you live in a culture that's so secular, and that word gets thrown around a lot. So what do I mean? A culture that tries to understand itself and promote itself without any reference to God. There is no pointing to something that's greater than anything we can control or do. So what's the greatest things in the world? Power, pleasure, sex, money, fame. Why? Well, we can control it and we can understand it. It's within our grasp. That's the secular mindset. Well, God is outside of that. He's bigger than that. And he's created our hearts that are actually already looking for him. The person who's so steeped in lust is deeply in touch with their longings for infinite life and love. They're just going to all the wrong places. So as a celibate man, I can say, I know what you're looking for, but you're not going to find it with any one body. You're only going to find it in his body. And I can point to Christ. So it's good. It's just not the greatest good.
I think that's a really good distinction to make. Like, as you said, it's a good, but it's not the greatest good, and sex isn't God. And I think a lot of times in our culture today, like, we often put the physical side and sex on this pedestal. So it can be very, like, different for people to hear that, and almost like alarming, because that's just not what's being preached today throughout our world. So that's just like an interesting viewpoint that I think a lot of people might wrestle with when they first hear about celibacy, or as they try to come to understand it. And just even to kind of clear up some of our language, I think when we talk about celibacy, a lot of times people just assume that it's a synonym for chastity. I know, especially being a missionary and working in the classrooms with teenagers, young adults, high school students, everything in between, when we come in there and we go in there and define chastity for them, often before we even preface it with that definition, we ask them, okay, like, here's chastity, what do you think? And almost every single time they're like, means you're a priest, you're a nun, basically means that sex is bad, like you can't have it. And so that's a lot of times the image that's been painted for them. So could you do the job for us of like kind of clarifying the distinction between two of them, and if there are parts that are similar and how they might be interwoven?
Yeah, no, that's great. Every single human being, whether you are celibate, married, single, old, young, you're called to chastity, right? Chastity is living your sexuality according to your state of life in line with God's plan, right? So living your sexuality according to God's plan in your state of life. That's an easier way to say it. That's chastity. Celibacy would be a subset of chastity. Celibacy, for the sake of the kingdom, as it's understood in priesthood and religious life, is a promise for what my state of life will be forever. So I'm saying I will live without any sort of sex as a verb, okay, forever. I'm surrendering that to God forever to point to what sex is actually all about, which is the union of persons, which happens most fully in the Trinity. All right, so chastity, living to God's plan of our sexuality according to our state of life. So married couples, they're actually living chastity. How? Well, God's plan for sexuality and marriage is that properly self-giving love and self-mastery and all these things, that you would be having sex. That's one of the goods of marriage, right? In fact, when I interview couples to be married and I do prep with them, if one of them may have a very like rigidity around sexuality, that's something I have to talk about, that fear and like holding your breath around sexuality, you're going to have a lot of trouble on your wedding day and your wedding marriage, because it's meant to be something that's beautiful and good, right? So sex is not outside of chastity. It's living your sexuality according to God's plan in your state of life. Now, if you're single, you're not celibate either. This is why sometimes a lot of confusion about the single vocation. I'm not going to step on that minefield, believe me. But, and I say that with a lot of mercy and playfulness, okay? So if you're struggling with being single, know that I know the heartache. I've heard it a lot. But single people aren't celibate because usually in their heart is a great desire for a spouse. What they are doing, and they're called to do, is live out their sexuality according to God's plan in their state of life. Since they don't have a spouse, they cannot engage in sexual activity because that would be a lie with their body. So celibacy is a lifelong, formally made vow in the church. Chastity is a call from really our creation, but especially from baptism.
Really good clarifier there. And I think it's really helpful because, I mean, I've seen it in the classroom, I'm sure you see it all the time. Just there is this thought and perception that that is what chastity means. And so I think that's so important, like clarifying, like celibacy is a vow that you take, and chastity is the universal call for everyone to know how to give and to receive love. And that just is like something that plays a role and part of your vocation as well. And it looks obviously differently for you. So if you wouldn't mind just like painting a picture for us, like what does it actually look like for someone to live out celibacy? Because some people might think it's just this super limiting thing, and life would definitely not have like being to this fullness. I think sometimes there's this negative picture around it, but like I've experienced and have the gift of having you in my life this past year, and just seeing the way that you live out your priesthood. I just think that it can illuminate for a lot of people what that experience might actually look like.
Yeah, no, well, first of all, thank you. And yeah, I think, which is weird because I'm celibate, but I still sometimes have these distorted images in my mind when I think of just the word celibate. I think of some weird man on a mountaintop that just kind of thinks deeply about life, and maybe he comes down and gives wisdom to the villagers, but then he goes back up. And that's still kind of like, it's still in me somewhere. I wish it wasn't. I wish that like Jesus just exercised that out of me. But I think the title father for a priest is very helpful, or even the fullness of the phrase, celibacy for the sake of the kingdom. Right? That's what Jesus calls it. Jesus never says, you'll be a celibate, you'll be this. It's always for the sake of the kingdom. So it's not in the negative, not what you give up. It's actually the positive, what you're doing, what you're gaining, which is to live for the kingdom. So the kingdom is ultimately those Jesus has brought into his life and who he's sharing with you. That's ultimately the kingdom. But it's a kingdom of persons. So Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are the first. Angels, the communion of saints. So it's a kingdom of people. But then everyone else who's in the church. So you've seen, I have a lot of young families who are about my age with kids, and they've become my family. There's 4 couples and about almost 20 kids among the 4 couples. And I'm there all the time. I've baptized the kids. I've renewed wedding vows. I've done masses for them. We've gone on vacations together. And I mean, the kids just know that Father Ryan's around. Like, it's kind of like, in fact, some of them call me uncle by accident, and they blush, the little kids. I mean, Father, I'm sorry. And they just don't know. There's like 4. But so for me, celibacy has looked like tons of relationships, right? But not just one exclusive relationship. So I don't want to make it seem like, oh, I get everything. At the end of the day, I can never say, that's my girl. That's my kid. Like, and it's not, in marriage, you get to say that in a possessive way, but that's still loving. It's not like ownership, you're mine, but like, that's my wife. And all the affection and intimacy and claims you get to make on that relationship. I don't get that kind of robust clinging, but I get little bits here and there. There's an old holy priest who said, marriage is like taking a bite out of an apple. It's rich, it's loud, it's crispy. He says, celibate love is like Concord grapes. They're small, they're precious. And he says, you get a little something. You don't starve to death as a celibate man, but you don't get the apple. You forego that so that you can have these little grapes. And there's more clusters of grapes. I get more people in my life, but I don't get one to the depth that you'd have in marriage. But that's because I'm meant to have the deepest parts of my heart just for God.
Yeah, I think that's such a good picture to paint for people, that like you are like still like building these relationships. Like you have tons of awesome relationships that like you're able to thrive in and serve in your vocation, and just like you're a human being. Like I think people forget that. Like once you get the collar on, I think people just kind of throw that out the door. I know like sometimes even from my experience, up until like, you know, kind of serving as a missionary and just having a lot of like regular interactions and building these relationships, I think that can be a perception. Like they're there, they give the sacraments, they do the thing, and then that's it. But it's just like, no, like you all have this call, like you were saying, to be celibate for the sake of the kingdom. And that doesn't mean that you can't be relational in that. And so I think from our conversation thus far, we've really been able to just touch on the aspects of what it truly means when we're talking about celibacy, and the beauty behind it, that it's not something that's a burden or just a big no, it's a gift. And so now knowing those things, I think we're in a better position to maybe talk about our culture's narrative when it comes to celibacy. So what do you think that narrative is in our culture, and why do you think that's the case?
Yeah, I think it depends which circle you're in the culture, but I think there's an impression like it's some sort of like secret club that is dark and from the medieval times. Like if you saw the movie Da Vinci Code, and there was that male actor who has albino, and he kind of wears those all these like, beating himself, and it's like this weird, extreme, secretive group. Or maybe some of the narrative is like uh, it's only for men who experience same-sex attraction. Um, or maybe in the most distorted forms, it's a place where maybe some sort of men who have pedophilia, they would hide out or something like that. I think that's the narrative. And I think part of the reason it got that way is, well, partially, always the media. Like I said at the very beginning, like we don't get a chance to talk about that celibacy is first a gift from God to me, that he wanted me so much for himself, that he would have been jealous if I was sharing myself. That's the first call, is to recognize the mad love of God for me and to say, gosh, I just want to be in that love every day. Now, every priest fell short, all fallen short from the glory of God, but we're trying, right? So I think not the media, the cultural understanding of the media only showing the brokenness, not the beauty. I think also, I mean, you know, I'm 37 and I know you're in your early to mid 20s. You guys have kind of come to life in the church already, where there was always theology of the body, or at least talked about in one way or another. I was born in 1983. Pope John Paul II was still delivering audiences on this teaching. So in my lifetime, it's gone from some weird thing that a Polish Pope was saying to being finally compiled in a book, to then being retranslated, to then slowly being broken down, misunderstood, confused, explained. And so the gift of theology of the body, which is to say the gift of understanding God's plan for our sexuality, hasn't even entered into the average mindset of the church, let alone priesthood. And so I think that's a big problem too. I always say that before I was called to be a priest, I'm a man. Like you said, I'm human. Like I am a man. I'm a guy. And now I'm not meant to be a cultural broken guy, obviously, but it doesn't mean I became an angel where I don't have a body and desires and things like. And I don't know that, and I know I make some other priests uncomfortable by talking like that on this thing, but I don't know that we've helped the church or society by us not talking about it. Like, and so the fact is that every priest is a sexual being. As gross and weird as it is to hear that, like we know that in our minds, and we have to just start recognizing that. And it's because my sexuality is meant to point to Christ's union for the church. And that's the real problem, is we don't see our sexuality as pointing to Jesus's union with the church. And so when we don't see that, we get nervous by it. We have to hide it, and somehow the priest can't be that, and all these things. But what needs to heal is first our understanding of male and female and the call to become one flesh. And then once we come to understand that, we can see why St. Paul said in Ephesians 5 that one flesh union is a great mystery, but I mean in regards to Christ and the church. And so I think that's why the narrative is so off, is not because the secular culture or the media is wrong. As a church, in our heart of hearts, we're scared to death of our sexuality, and we don't know what it means. And so we go, well, that priest is just somehow doing something supernatural, so that's cool. We'll just do a spiritual life, and then I'll just live our human life. And the word became flesh and destroyed any notion of that division. So.
Yeah, I like the point that you were just saying, like, we can't just like point the finger at the culture and blame them for everything. We have to do an internal look of like, how are we preaching on this? Like, how are we speaking about these topics, and like really fostering the sense of like, okay, what does it mean to be human? How does our sexuality come to play in that? So yeah, the impact of TOB on the church has been a gift thus far, and hoping that it will continually to transform like the following generation. So there is this better understanding of what it actually means. And even the case, I know we talked about how we also need to work within. I also think the media does play a part at just showing this brokenness. And sometimes I think that they can just say that celibacy can lead to desires being pushed to the side and imprudent decisions are being made out of lust. Like, what would you say to that point of view? And is there any truth to it?
Yeah, I'd say there's truth to that in celibacy, or as we even talked about earlier, it's truth true in chastity too. Like that if your approach to virtue, to living out your sexuality with integrity and according to God's plan, would be like holding your breath when you have lustful temptations, or just kind of shoving them around and running from them, like, no, 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 no. It's only going to be a matter of time before you're going to have to indulge. So I think it is a way of doing it. It's obviously not helpful. It's going to lead you into sin and pain and shame. But I don't think the intent of Christ instituting celibacy and what the church has prized it to be and what very holy priests and nuns and other people have lived out, that's certainly not what they're doing. And I always love the saints, to point to the saints. So it's like, do you think Mother Teresa was shoving away her desire to love and care and nurture and be like connected to people so that she could be doing something lustful? How about St. John Paul II? I mean, we see these men, we're like, well, no, not them. Okay, well, then obviously it's not celibacy. Now, that's not to say all of us who have said yes to celibacy can't use prayers and mercy. But it is to say that celibacy isn't the problem. It's usually, do you have people and God that you can be transparent with? That's the real struggle. And that's really a call for all of us is, do you have friends and people in your prayer? Are you able to go before them and say, like, Lord, this is where I'm at. And I know this desire or thought is not of you, but this is what is in me. This is what's going on. And allow him to look upon us and to feel the smile of God, even upon us there, to say, my gosh, you're still choosing me. I want your love. I want your way of loving. And he begins to elicit out of us greater desires and more beautiful desires, ordering our desires.
I love that. It's like not just priests who need to take the interior look and hold themselves accountable to those things, but like we as a whole church and the laity and people who are discerning or in marriage, like need to continue that evaluation of like, are my desires properly ordered? And so, I mean, obviously within the church, we often expect priests to like be this example and this higher call. And like when mistakes come about or we hear things that happen in the media, I think that often just paints a picture and people often just project that onto every priest, which is an unfair assumption because we are a fallen people. And we like someone who's in the single life right now, like it's true. Like we too make mistakes. So I think it's so important to do that self-evaluation wherever your call is in your state of life. And I just also want to take a moment to address like maybe someone who is discerning or thinking about it, or maybe has never thought about being a priest. Sometimes you can hear in a conversation of being like, well, like maybe if they just like remove that whole celibacy thing, like they would get more vocations. Do you think there's any truth to that at all? Or do you believe that that's just an excuse?
Yeah, I remember, I think I was 20 when I first started healing the nudge to become a priest. And at that time I was pursuing improv comedy and jazz trumpet. And I remember telling people, I think I like girls too much to do that. So yeah, I certainly know that sentiment. Studies find that like in your Byzantine rite, they're struggling with vocations just as much, if not more than the Latin rite where celibacy is mandated. And to be honest, our Protestant brothers and sisters, they struggle with having ministers as well. So I don't think, although people may say, well, I don't know about celibacy thing, I don't know that actually across the board, it would statistically make sense. Although I think I do hear that quite a bit. So I don't think it holds when you look at the numbers.
Now it makes sense. I just thought it was worth asking because
sure.
Maybe if someone was thinking that, like, gosh, that seems like such a high call, something that's like, I like girls too much, and that seems like a lot to give up. Just like a good thing to like, that's actually probably not what's inhibiting you from doing this vocation, and kind of taking an honest look at that. So just 3 more judgments and opinions that might be out there in terms to when it comes to celibacy. So the first of which, because I did a survey for some people and I was like, okay, like what are your initial impressions when you hear the word celibacy? Like what might people think? And one of the things that I heard pretty consistently was that priests are just white knuckling it and they don't actually want to live it out. It's just something they have to do. What would you say to that?
I'll just be real honest, even though I'm on camera. Yeah, I think there's moments or days where it certainly feels that way. But I talk to people who are single and living out chastity, and there's moments and days where it feels like that as well. So living our sexuality according to God's plan means specifically it's not according to the culture's plan. And the culture is just, if you have a scratch, itch it. And we believe in self-mastery and self-renunciation and self-sacrifice. And those are seen as the pathway to misery. And so I would say that that there are moments and times where you just got to push through. It's true. However, I think that the more you talk to priests, and you have to talk to happy priests, and people in the pews, all of you know when you find a priest who's happy and alive, you know the difference. And if you talk to them and say, do you think you could still do this ministry with a wife and kids? I think every one of them would say no. And I think when you're faced with that, you realize, man, the happiness and joy I'm getting out of ministering to others and the prayer life I have and opportunities to go and retreat and think deeply and pray, that it really would have to be an either or. I don't think it's as white knuckled then. I think it's like there's a deeper surrendering. But yeah, the whole language though is celibacy as gift, of spousal imagery. Once again, only been in the church that's been around for 2,000 years. It's only been most strongly articulated and accepted in the last 30 years. So it's still new. I mean, and for things to break into the seminaries and teach guys, it's still relatively new. But yeah, I don't think most guys, their habitual stance is white knuckling.
No, that's such a good point. And it's more of almost like an outsider perspective, because they just assume like, gosh, like those desires would be so hard to push away from me. Like that's what must be like their thought process. They might just like be white knuckling their way through this. And as you said, like there's different difficulties, different desires that pop up, but you just do it. And you're given the grace through that vocation to persevere. Another thought and opinion that someone expressed was that priests should just get with the times. Maybe it was this idea in the culture before, but it really doesn't make sense anymore. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think like, of what times are we talking about for one? Like, are we talking about like the Tinder app? Should priests leave their celibacy and join Tinder? Are we talking about hookup websites? Are we talking about the pornography culture? What exactly are with the times? Would we say any of those are helping marriage? Would you say any of those are making women feel honored and men feel confident and strong and hopeful? So get with the times is a little confusing, but I don't want to go too strong on that person. I'm sure they had a good meaning. So I would also say this. I think every person needs to decide this for themselves. But if you look around, a lot of people are engaged in sexual activity. And I don't see a lot of happy people. And so I don't know that sex is delivering the happiness that people think it's promising. And it's not because, therefore, all of them should become celibate. I just mean that sex outside the way that we were created to be is like putting Coca-Cola in a gasoline tank of your car. The car was created to run on gasoline. If you put Coca-Cola in there, it's going to break down over time. The human heart, the emotions, the psyche, all of those things break down over time. And so too does the body, actually. And so it's important to recognize that to get with the times, I don't know, we are the highest amount of antidepressants ever as a culture. I don't know that I want to be with those times. I want to be a time where people are full of hope and joy and meaningful relationships. And so in that case, I don't know that celibacy should change because somehow the cultural times don't understand it. I think we have to do a better job of explaining it. Me and my brother priest, we have to be more deeply appreciative of it and living it out in greater integrity and virtue. But I don't know that it needs to change.
Boom. I love you just calling it out. Just the way that it is. It's so true. It's like, what are we actually getting from this culture and getting with the times? Is it actually fulfilling those desires and how we've been created? So, and I also just love like the call of it's like, okay, it's not even just the culture, but we need to do a better job within to shaping that understanding. So that's beautiful. I love that response. All right. And our last judgment that someone shared with me was that priests, they can't really have friendships with women because, it might be too tempting. It doesn't really seem appropriate. It just doesn't seem to align with their vocation. Like, give me some honest thoughts when it comes to that.
Yeah, well, I'll repeat the famous phrases from the early church, which was Christian, know thyself. There may be brother priests who they just know themselves, like that their hearts become too tormented by being around women. And they just like, it's just too painful. I can't do it. And so I'm going to just have my priest friend, and I'll minister to everyone else. And so Christian, know thyself. For me, I've been blessed with, I know I need my feminine friends in my life. They actually renew in me a commitment to vulnerability with God. They draw out of me an awareness of tenderness and attentiveness and listening that I wouldn't automatically get from my brother priests. And I don't always, maybe at this point in my journey, hopefully eventually I don't receive fully from prayer alone. But I also know that I'm not really good friends with any one woman who isn't in a very healthy and happy marriage. I'm not super close to any single women. Now, I have single women friends, but I would never be exclusively close with them, because there's just dynamics there that aren't present when I'm talking to someone's wife. I also know that I wouldn't be very, very good friends with a wife if I also wasn't friends with the husband on some level. And so these are things I've learned about myself to make sure everything stays in the light and to make sure that we are mutually blessing each other. So I know that some priests have struggled or gotten in trouble in different places in the United States because some of those things that I've had for those boundaries that I just named probably weren't honored enough. And so, but yeah, Christian, know thyself. There is absolutely no shame in saying I can't participate in something that's good because it won't be good for me. In fact, to know that and live by that is immensely holy, and that person should be commended and be an example to others.
Yeah, I think like you're saying, that self-knowledge piece is key, not even just for priests, but like every single person, just like setting those boundaries that are appropriate for that your state in life and that other person's, and just knowing that dynamic. And like you said, like it's not necessarily like it's a bad thing, but like also if you know your response might not be one of virtue or one that's going to lead to those things, like, yeah, just taking the proper precautions. And that can apply to anyone, but more specifically also to priests as they were just recognizing their call. So that's really beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. Father Ryan, as we wrap up here, are there any final notes or messages that you want people to walk away from this conversation about when it comes to celibacy? Any final thoughts?
Yeah, I guess the only final thoughts I would say is Jesus is the only one that satisfies the human heart. Now that's kind of pious and trite, and Culture Project missionaries know me by now. I'm not tend to fall in those type of categories normally. But this is what I mean is, no man will satisfy a woman's heart fully. No woman will satisfy a man's heart fully, because our hearts are looking for infinite love. And by infinite, I mean like literally you can't contain it kind of love. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, we want to be loved and honored and blessed, and we want to be loving and honoring and blessing. We want that perfection, that flourishing. The truth is, ain't no one going to be able to do that for you. All right. And because it's infinite and creatures are finite. And so what I have done is I have listened to the call of the infinite one made flesh. Infinite love took on flesh. Infinite beauty took on flesh in Jesus. And he's called me to say, I want you to be mine. See, I'm not foregoing the human heart and our deepest desires. I'm claiming the one who will satisfy them. And it's not a shedding of my humanity or a rejecting of it. It's an honoring the parts that can sometimes be mocked by culture. You're naive, you want too much, you're being childish, grow up. And it's saying, no, I'm not being childish, I'm being childlike to an infinite God who promises me fulfillment, and I'm going to take him at his word. And so celibacy is one of the deepest affirming things to our humanity. It's not an annihilation of my masculinity. It's actually the fulfillment or the path towards fulfillment, which only happens in heaven for all of us. So that's what I want to say.
I love that. Just like knowing where our fulfillment is at, and that celibacy is just a beautiful thing, and it is a gift. And I think you've just done an incredible job today of just communicating that and offering a witness. So thank you so much for joining us this afternoon and just sharing the gift of your priesthood with us. If you like this, you can join again next Friday and then the following Friday for Ask a Priest Again. We are doing this series here. So tune in for the next 2 Fridays at 12 p.m. to get more of Father Ryan Mann. I'm sure they will be just as incredible. And to continue with us today, be sure to tune in this evening to catch the next Culture Project Live episode tonight at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Join us as we continue the book study on men, women, and the mystery of love. It's going to be a great conversation, so we hope to see you there. And just know that during this time, the mission of the Culture Project continues and lives on. And if you feel so called to help and support us, consider making a donation today at thecultureproject.org/donate. Thank you to everyone for tuning in, and it was just wonderful to be with you all, and God bless.